Well, I don't know about full-time, but the very beginning was I would sing all the time to express myself, my joy, my fun, and I would sing with my mother and my auntie Sylvia, who's another great singer. All my mother's family were really good singers.
They were one of the biggest rock bands of the 1980s, selling millions of albums and filling arenas with anthems like Here I Go Again and Is This Love. But behind the glamour and screaming fans, Whitesnake was collapsing from within. Endless lineup changes, clashing egos, and the crushing weight of fame tore the band apart. At 71, frontman David Coverdale finally admitted, it couldn't last. What really caused one of rock's most powerful voices to watch his own band unravel? David Coverdale's story begins before Whitesnake, during his time as the singer of Deep Purple in the mid-1970s. When that legendary band fractured, Coverdale was left to reinvent himself. In 1978, he formed Whitesnake, initially envisioned as a blues rock outfit, inspired by his love for soulful vocals and heavy guitar riffs. The early lineup featured top British musicians, including guitarist Bernie Marsden and bassist Neil Murray. Together they crafted a sound that blended raw blues with hard rock power, albums like Ready and Willing and Come and Get It Made. Whitesnake a rising force in Europe, but it wasn't until the mid-1980s that they broke through in America. The self-titled Whitesnake album released in 1987 was the turning point. Fueled by iconic singles like Here I Go Again and Is This Love, the record went multi-platinum and catapulted Coverdale and the band into superstardom. Their music videos dominated MTV, with Coverdale's then-wife Tawny Kitaen becoming a pop culture symbol as she danced across car hoods in the Here I Go Again video. But success came at a price. With fame came pressure, the demand for bigger tours, bigger shows, and bigger hits. And as Whitesnake's profile soared, cracks began to form within the band. While fans saw Whitesnake as a single, unstoppable force, behind the scenes, the group was more like a revolving door. Coverdale was the heart and voice of the band, but almost every other position seemed temporary. Guitarists, drummers, and bass players came and went with dizzying frequency. This constant turnover created instability. Musicians often clashed over creative direction, pay, and recognition. Some felt overshadowed by Coverdale's dominance as the sole decision-maker. By the late 1980s, the lineup that recorded Whitesnake's biggest hits was already dissolving. The pressures of global fame only made things worse. Touring schedules were grueling, and the industry demanded follow-up hits to match their blockbuster success. Coverdale himself later admitted that the stress of managing so many egos, while also trying to protect the band's momentum, became overwhelming. As the faces on stage changed year after year, fans and critics began to notice. Was Whitesnake truly a band, or just Coverdale surrounded by whichever musicians happened to be available? The revolving door reputation would haunt them, and it foreshadowed the collapse that Coverdale would one day openly admit. By the late 1980s, Whitesnake was on top of the world. Their self-titled 1987 album sold more than 8 million copies in the United States alone, and the Slip of the Tongue tour brought the band to massive stadiums. On the outside, it looked like the dream every rock band chased, but on the inside, things were falling apart. Coverdale was dealing with vocal problems, requiring surgery to repair his throat. At the same time, the revolving door lineup reached a breaking point. Guitarist John Sykes, who had co-written much of the 1987 album, was dismissed before the band's biggest moment of success. Later, Steve Vai was brought in to replace him for the Slip of the Tongue era, bringing his own flamboyant style that clashed with the band's bluesy roots. The pressure to repeat success strained everyone involved. Coverdale admitted years later, "I was surrounded by amazing players, but we weren't a band anymore. We were a corporation." What had started as a tight blues rock group had become a brand, with Coverdale carrying the entire weight on his shoulders. That realization was a turning point. Whitesnake wasn't just suffering from burnout, it was collapsing under the weight of its own success. As the 1990s began, Whitesnake's internal issues became impossible to hide. Coverdale's health problems, combined with endless lineup changes, left fans questioning the band's stability. Critics accused them of being more focused on image than music, pointing to MTV's glossy videos and the constant media spotlight on Coverdale's relationship with Tawny Kitaen. Egos clashed not just among musicians, but also with managers and record executives. The demand for arena-sized hits put enormous pressure on Coverdale, who struggled to balance creative control with commercial expectations. The once celebrated chemistry within the group had dissolved, replaced by business meetings, disputes over royalties, and personal rivalries. By 1991, the band splintered. Coverdale took a step back, later admitting, "I had to walk away before it destroyed me completely." The collapse wasn't one dramatic explosion, but rather a slow unraveling, the result of years of exhaustion, clashing personalities, and the inability to sustain success at the highest level. For fans who had watched Whitesnake rise to the top, it was heartbreaking. The band that once promised rock immortality had imploded under its own weight. The collapse of Whitesnake in the early 1990s left both the band and its fans reeling. For millions who had embraced the anthems of "Here I Go Again" and "Is This Love," the sudden silence was jarring. Arena tours stopped, and the faces that had become synonymous with the band scattered into other projects. Critics wasted no time pointing fingers. Many argued that Whitesnake had become a one-man show, with David Coverdale acting more as a CEO than as a bandmate. Others saw the band's downfall as inevitable, the result of chasing commercial success in an era when glam metal was already starting to fade under the rising tide of grunge. For Coverdale, the consequences were deeply personal. His relationship with Tawny Kitaen, once a centerpiece of the band's MTV fame, collapsed in a very public divorce. His health also remained fragile, and he was forced to rethink not just his career, but his entire lifestyle. Fans, however, never fully let go. Even as Whitesnake crumbled, the demand for their music endured. Radio stations kept the hits alive, and for many, Whitesnake's downfall only added to the myth. A band that flew too close to the sun and burned out in spectacular fashion. In later years, David Coverdale spoke more openly about the reasons Whitesnake fell apart. At 71, he admitted it was never just one thing. It was a storm of egos, endless lineup changes, and the impossible task of sustaining success at the very top. It stopped being fun, he reflected. And when the joy is gone, there's no point. Despite the collapse, Coverdale's legacy remained secure. He occasionally revived Whitesnake with new lineups, proving the name still carried enormous power. Tours in the 2000s and 2010 drew crowds eager to relive the glory days, even if the classic lineup was long gone. Looking back, Whitesnake's story feels like a classic rock tragedy, brilliant, explosive, and impossible to sustain. At their peak, they embodied the excess of the 1980s, stadium tours, flashy videos, platinum records, and a frontman who commanded the spotlight. But that same excess was their undoing. Endless lineup changes shattered any sense of unity, and the relentless demand for bigger success drained the joy out of making music. David Coverdale's honesty at 71 reveals the human side of the story. Beneath the leather jackets and roaring crowds was a man crushed by pressure, strained by ego battles, and forced to admit that the band he built couldn't last forever. His reflections show not bitterness, but acceptance. Whitesnake gave the world unforgettable songs, and Coverdale himself both glory and heartbreak. In the end, the band's collapse didn't erase their legacy. If anything, it made it more powerful, a cautionary tale of what happens when fame becomes too heavy to carry, but also a celebration of music that still echoes decades later. Thanks for watching. Click here to check another video and make sure to subscribe to our channel.